welcome back, and before we get into things I wanted to apologize for the length of this video. It's going to be a little bit heavy on everything to do with the new ReDrive that has arrived, but I wanted you to see all that's involved in tweaking that. So anyway, before we get onto that, these are the parachute straps. Devin's been cutting out the parts for these. These are the brackets that mount the rear straps there to the aft bulkhead, and you'll see that in a future episode. And on Wednesday I took these spade brackets back up to Britt so he could re-weld the little tabs there that the aileron push rods connect to, because initially we had them just straight and they needed to be at about 18 degrees to match the wing sweep. And so he did that, and he also sandblasted them for us, and since then Jeff has sprayed them with an etch primer. And here's the spade as well, and I actually beveled the edges of those so they weren't just square, using this little device that Britt has, and then Jeff has etch primed those as well. And here you can see Jeff has mounted one of the strobe lights there, strobe nav position lights. It's actually mounted to that outer skin now, and the mounting really all it involves is just putting a nut plate behind there, and then also just aligning or drilling the alignment hole. So he's got that one done, as you can see. And so that needs to have the wires extended a little bit there so they can come down to where the access panel will be and have a connector. And here Devin is drilling out those plates there for the parachute strap mount points, and he has to drill them on an angle and out to 3/4, so that's a bit of a challenge. So he's just using a step drill there to take it up and work his way up to the 3/4 dimension. And I went up to Blairsville on Wednesday afternoon after I'd been at Britt's in the morning, and I went and picked up everything for the ReDrive that is now ready. So these are the different pieces there. You see you've got the 2 different housings and the shaft there, and the 4 different mounting brackets. And we also have the little oil rings there. Those are those semicircular ones that are there. So all those bits now have to be fitted correctly and tested and make sure everything's all good, and then ultimately assembled. So like everything on this project, I decided to treat it like a software engineer and unit test every little aspect. So here I'm just using a syringe, and I'm testing all the internal paths from the outside connectors to the inside holes where things come through to make sure that everything is flowing the way it's supposed to do, because there's paths that have been cross-linked and stuff and drilled in behind there. And the first one I was testing there was the feed to the propeller, which is the high pressure oil feed. And it goes in the top there, and it comes out that little hole in the middle. And that one tested out okay. So the next one was this cross feed. So this is the one that is the main feed for the journals, and you see squirting the water in the top there, and it actually comes out where the journal bearings are, one on the left and one on the right. So that one appears to be working okay, and I've also got little bits of paper in there in the little holes where the feeds were actually drilled, which they'll ultimately be capped, and so I've just basically put paper in there so the water doesn't come out those holes. Anyway, so those feeds look like they're working correctly, so they've been drilled correctly all the way through, so happy about that. So it goes in that hole there, in the top hole in the middle, and then comes out on either side there behind the journal bearings. And now we're moving over to the other side, and so this one is the one that actually has the feed, the main oil feed in the top of it, and it cross feeds to the other side of that other housing. So the main oil goes in there, and it cross feeds through that hole to the other housing. So I've blocked off the journal bearings there with some paper just to make sure that this cross feed is there as well. And as you can see, and the water's going across there, so that means that the cross feed will work correctly. So we have oil going to both sides, both housings, and then coming out on the journal bearings on either side. And this time I've opened up the journal bearing outlets there, and I'm testing to make sure that they work on this housing like I did on the other side. So they're just putting some water in the middle feed there and making sure, looking to see that it's coming out where the journal bearings are. And as you can see there, that is working, both coming out both sides as expected. So that's good. And I wonder if you're noticing there, but the water is now draining through the drain holes there into that lower gallery, and that's kind of how that's supposed to work. So there's 4 different ways that it gets in there. That's one of the ones there I'm pointing to, from the end, from where the end of the shaft is. And I noticed actually, so you've got this feed here, that's the drain there, and that feeds into the gallery, and then on the other side there's supposed to be one there, but it's not there. So it looks like Barry's crew forgot to do that, so there's a job for me to do. Gonna have to drill on an angle there, that hole, and get it in there. So, and also too, it looks like they've forgot to drill out to the right size and tap some of these holes. Like that's a plug hole there that they did with MPT4, and these ones are supposed to, sorry, eighth inch NPT. They didn't do those. And also on this one, the same thing. There's two holes there that are supposed to be plugs, the front and back ones, and then the middle one is the main feed. That's supposed to be 1/4 inch NPT for an AN6 fitting, and they didn't do that one either. So I got work to do all that. But the first thing I wanted to do is make sure I didn't have any showstoppers here. So I'm making sure that these oil rings here that keep the high pressure oil back, making sure that they're fitting in correctly and they're not sort of stopping the housing from closing it. But then I started putting it together and I realized this, as you see, that first bolt just went in nicely, and this next bolt, just drop it in and she won't go in. So I actually had to push on that a lot. So it turns out this brand new bolts from Aircraft Spruce, and they're slightly bent. So 2 out of the 4 were slightly bent, and I don't know if you can see that there with the ruler, but basically not straight. So the next job for me to do was to actually take those over to my vise and give them a little bit of love with a hammer and see if I could straighten those out. So that's what I'm doing here. Just put a mark on where the high spot is or where the bend is, and then just give them a few taps and check them for straight again, and see how that all works out. So I had to do quite a few iterations there ultimately, but after doing that and getting it somewhat straighter, then actually it pretty much drops in now and needs a little bit more. So anyway, more work to do. So next up, having the housing bolted together with just the oil rings in place. I wanted to make sure that the oil rings weren't holding the housing apart. So I'm looking there at the gap to see if there is any gap there, and actually it looks like there's not. So the oil rings are snug and the housing is snug. So that's a good first start, knowing that everything's fitting the way it's supposed to be. And then so the next step is to step up and put the journal bearings in, and then test it for the same thing to make sure that the journal bearings don't hold it apart. But noticed ahead of time there that some of these little spots here, and again this is a prototype, so we're just learning, those little spots where the oil feeds come through, they had sort of little burrs on them just because of the way they were drilled. So I had to basically sort of file those off a little bit first before I could put the journal bearings in. And so this is what I'm doing right now, putting in the first journal bearing, and I need to make sure that it sits in there nicely. And there's these little tabs on there that stops them from rotating and stops them from sliding out sideways as well. And so I had to make sure that the little notches that we had made in the housings themselves that accept the space for the tab, make sure that those were large enough. And again, because prototype and because we just sort of measured them, or at least I measured them initially from the bearings and Mark put them in the CAD, they were a little bit small, so I had to get in there with a file and file those out a little bit more in order to make sure that the journals sat down nicely. So anyway, quite a few iterations to get this sorted out. And once again, I'm checking to see that the housing is closed up nicely on itself there, and that looks actually pretty good there. There's no extra gaps there, so it means that the bolts there that are pulling across the journal bearings are doing their job. But I also checked on the inside there to see how the journal bearings were sitting, and I noticed a couple of them where they sort of one edge meets the other side. I noticed that they weren't sort of sitting nicely there, so that meant I had to adjust or file back a little bit where those tabs are a little bit more. But anyway, just a couple of iterations and I got that sorted out, and they were all looking really good in there. Again, I'm just unit testing everything. I don't want to have any surprises with this thing. So after having done that, now I've got the journal bearings in. I've also put the oil rings back in there, and I've basically painted them with the black marker, as you can see there. And so what I want to do right now is put the shaft in there and make sure that they don't rub. The oil rings aren't rubbing on the shaft, because they're supposed to only be like 1.5 thou clearance in order to allow the 300 psi pressure oil to build up and pass through into the prop. So here, as you can see, the next step here is to put the shaft in place there, and I put some oil on the, and then putting some more oil on the journal bearings as well, and then close up the case there. And then as you can see, one of those rings is a little bit loose, so it has this tendency to drop out. So if I do it on an angle like that, it doesn't do that. And then I can put the bolts back in and tighten everything up. Now I'm not like fully torquing them, and I'm not I'm just using some nylock locking nuts right now. Later on, those will be metal locking nuts. So again, all this isn't supposed to be anything like the final assembly. It's just all testing. So the hardware isn't final hardware, and torque settings aren't final torque settings. It's just near enough's good enough right now. So once that's together, the job is to rotate that prop shaft a bunch and put pressure on it in different directions, just to see if any of those oil rings are actually engaging the shaft. And initially they were. The oil rings were slightly too tight against the shaft, and as you'll see here, once I opened it all up again, you can see where the oil rings, the shaft had been sort of rubbing there on the rings, and you can see the black markers gone from the rings there in a couple of places, and same on there. You can see that it's all sort of shiny on those rings right there. So that meant I had to sand that off a little bit, so probably had to take off a couple of thou on those. And there you can see the marks there on the shaft, those two rings there in the center where it was rubbing. So we actually wanted to see what kind of clearance as well there was for the journal bearings, because they're supposed to have a couple of thou clearance as well. And so we've got this stuff there that allows you to measure how much gap there is when you close it down. So I actually used that and figured out that we got the right clearance there. So my job now was to fix these oil rings. So with some 400 grit sandpaper and just carefully working the areas there that were engaging the shaft, I just basically spent iteration after iteration sanding them down, and then coloring them again with the black marker and putting the whole thing back together again, and then rotating the shaft a bunch of times and rotating the housing and pushing on either side of it, just trying everything I can to see if I can get it to the oil rings to rub on the shaft in order to see where I needed to clear them out some more. And it took the best part of about 6 hours of work to get the 4 oil rings sorted out. Anyway, in the meantime, Jeff has been busy getting these things bonded into place. So that's the spade bracket there. He's got the FR4 mounts for that, and he's bonded that one in. There's the other one ready to go, has the FR4 bolted to it. So yeah, those are coming along. So things are progressing other than what I've been working on. And this is the aileron trim tab motor. So that's pretty much all bonded into place there, and just has that last connection to be hooked up to the aileron trim tab, and I believe that one still has to have the hinges connected. And now we're on to Friday morning, and I've given Devin a job of creating a template here for this little false floor area for where the pilot and co-pilot's feet are, because with the shape of the cabin you end up with this sort of curvature of the fuselage, and we need a flat area there so you can rest your heels on there in order to work the rudder pedals correctly. So I printed out sort of what I thought would be the template from the CAD, and he's making a cardboard template just to make sure it all fits in the cabin there. And then once he has that template sorted out, he can actually cut some carbon fiber. We actually have some flat stock that's sort of scrap left from the foreplane when we trimmed the sort of root ends from the foreplane. So there's the cardboard sitting in place there, and that's what it looks like with the carbon fiber. And actually that piece ended up going to the other side and flipped over, as you'll see in a little while. But that's the idea, to basically make a nice flat false floor for resting your heels on so you can use the rudders. And it's still Friday morning, and I'm working on still sorting out these oil rings and just sort of sanding them down. So I did 2 at a time, and as I said, it took me about 6 hours, so there was several hours on Thursday afternoon and pretty much all of Friday morning up until about lunchtime before I had them sorted out, just going through this same process of iterating and sanding and stuff. So anyway, here I am pretty much at the last go around and just checking everything here again, putting everything back together and doing a final test there just to make sure that I don't have any contact at all. And with the run out that's on the shaft, and when I say run out, the ability for it to move around a little bit in the journal bearings, I actually go through this process where I sort of push on the shaft and sort of try and angle it in different angles, in order to try and make those oil rings engage the shaft, which is what I don't want, But anyway, it's spinning nice and freely in there, actually working really well. We still don't have the thrust washers in there. We're actually waiting for those to come back from the guys there at CRI, because they needed to be taken down a little bit. I should have them next week. But anyway, as you can see here, pulling this apart, there's no marks there on that shaft anymore, and the oil ring's actually looking pretty good. So I just use a little screwdriver there to sort of rotate them around a little bit and pull it out with the pliers. And I'm not sure if you can see that there on the camera, but looking pretty good there. All the black markers pretty much on there still. So that's that job out of the way now, finally. And on to the next job. And if you recall earlier, that little drain hole was missing. So what I did here is I took the other one, which had the drain hole, and found out the angle that hole was drilled at, just by mounting it in the vise and putting in this 1/4 inch rod there that fits in the hole, and then just with the inclinometer measuring that angle there. So all I had to do was set up the other one that didn't have the hole at the same angle, and then I can use the machine to do it. So, but again, not having done this before, again, iteration. So I started out with my centering drill bit, because I'm trying to drill a hole on a 50-degree angle on a sloped metal, so it's a little bit tricky to get it started there. So centering drill seemed to bite in there when I was just very careful with it, and but that one was flexing, the long one, so I got the short one and started with that one, and that one actually worked really good. I was able to get the sort of hole started there on that angle, and then from there I switched over onto the step drill to see how far I could get with that, and I just want to go to 1/4 inch. So that was somewhat successful, but I was having sort of problems in that I ran out of sort of clearance. So then I switched over to the 1/4 inch bit, and that was just again flexing on the angle there. Wasn't able to find the hole wasn't big enough yet. So what I ended up doing was switching over to a 1/4 inch end mill that I normally use for milling, as you can see here, and that worked great. So I started out with it really short, so it wouldn't flex at all, and it cut into that face nicely, and was able to establish the 1/4 inch hole. And then what I did was I actually took the end mill on that on the fitting there on the chuck and basically extended it out, as you can see here, so I had more travel available with it to drill, and stepped that through, and that almost got all the way through there, but the collet there was just about to hit on the housing itself, so I had to sort of stop at that point, and then what I did was I just finally switched to the regular 1/4 inch drill bit to finish everything off. and as you'll see here in a second, that worked fine. So it was a multi-step process. It took quite a while to get it all done, and I'm sure the guys at CRI, if they had remembered to do that, they would have just done it as one of their paths and bang, it would have been done. Anyway, it took me about an hour to do that, just because of the iterations and figuring it out. And so here you can see now I'm on the 1/4-inch drill bit and just about to break through into that lower gallery there, which was what I'm doing. This is actually sped up in this little last bit of video here, and you can see they are broken through. So that's that job now done. And now moving on to enlarging these holes there that weren't tapped, enlarging them to the right hole size before I can actually run the tap in there. And meanwhile, Jeff and Devin are working on finishing off these little foot pads there for the footwells there in the fuselage. Jeff's just clearing off the paint there around the outside edge so we can have something to bond to. And that's that one from the other side now flipped over on this side. As you can see, it sort of flames that one around the edge there so it can have the layup on it. And back here I've managed to drill and tap the first hole. There, or actually drill the first hole. I'm just about to tap it there. Got my tapping gear and get that one underway. And here the guys got both of those foot pads in there, and they're just doing a layup in there. I've got some cabo on there around the edge, and they're just doing a layup to sort of bond those in. They'll also have like a little step, a ramp sort of up to them from the other part behind, or sort of underneath the seats there. So it won't just be like a big step there, it'll be a little ramp up there, and that'll come next week. But here you can see they've got this one with a layup in there and some peel ply on there, and ultimately there's going to be carpet all over the top of that, so you won't really see any of this stuff. It'll just be a nice little ramp in there. And there's the other one on the other side there with the layup and the peel ply around there. So that's looking good. And then what we're going to do is spray some expanding foam under there to really sort of reinforce all that so it doesn't flex. And Jeff got that other spade bracket bonded into place there, as you can see with the FR4. And then the first one down here has also was bonded in, but now you can see it has a layup on it as well, just to reinforce it. So that's that job done. And I'm still working. I've got a couple more holes to tap on Monday, and then the job next will be to wait for these new bearings to show up, and also the thrust bearings, and get this thing assembled and onto the engine mount. So hopefully that all goes smoothly next week. Anyway, that's our update for this week, and thanks again for watching, and tune in next week and see where we get to.